I want to welcome you to another video Drasha. This week's Parsha is Shemini. But I want to speak on another subject today other than the Torah portion, because this week and next week we have several important occasions on the Jewish calendar, holidays that are modern Jewish holidays. You know, it's something that I've noted for a long time, how Jewish holidays tend to clump together, so that in the fall we have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot all within a short period of time. Of course, these holidays are all related. In the spring we have Purim, Pesach, and Shavuot that come within a relatively short period of time, and of course also again are all interrelated. But in the spring now, this time of year, both this week and next week, we have three modern holidays that come one right after the other and again are interconnected. The first of these is the occasion of Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And then next week we will have Yom HaZikaron, the Israeli Memorial Day, and then Yom HaAtzmaut, the very next day in Israel is Israeli Independence Day. By the way, I think that it is significant and really was a very good way of scheduling these things, that the Memorial Day, the day on which the country remembers those who sacrificed themselves for the creation of the state, the preservation and the defense of the state, that comes immediately prior to Yom HaAtzmaut, to Israeli Independence Day, so that those things are clear, so that on Independence Day, one has just finished thinking about those who sacrificed so that we might have an independent Jewish state. But the two occasions that are marked by the holiday, the occasions of the Holocaust Remembrance Day and Israeli Independence Day, these are dates of tremendous note, because really these two events, the Holocaust on the one hand and the rebirth of the State of Israel on the other, are the two most significant occurrences in Jewish history since biblical times. It is hard to overestimate the significance of both of these events. You know, persecution has been a part of Jewish history throughout the course of Jewish history. Pogroms, various slaughters, expulsions, all kinds of anti-Jewish legislation and discrimination were part of Jewish life for centuries. But the Holocaust was on a scale unlike anything in our history. The only thing that one can compare it to is the destruction of the temple and ultimately the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70 CE. You know, when we look back at those events and we see that the religious center of Judaism was the temple, and of course Jerusalem was the political center of the Jewish sovereign state, both of those were destroyed. And it certainly is a question, and we've posed this question and we've spoken about this on numerous occasions. It really is a question to say, how did we survive that? How did Judaism survive the destruction of its religious center, being the temple? And how did we survive as a people when our capital was destroyed and when the Jewish sovereignty was lost and Jews were scattered all over the globe? How do you explain the continuation of Judaism? How do you explain the continuation of the Jewish people? These are questions that we have spoken about on many occasions. But the event of the Holocaust also is of a similar nature. When we think of the scale of the loss, close to half of the Jewish population was murdered. Communities that had existed for centuries and that had really been the centers of Jewish learning, Jewish life, Jewish culture, those places were destroyed all in a very short period of time. And you say, how did the Jewish people survive this? How are we surviving the destruction of such a large percentage of our population and the destruction of what were the great centers of Jewish life? I mean, that is a question that is on a par with how did we survive the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem? Of course, in answer to that question, we talked about how there were other institutions that took the place of the temple, the synagogue, the study of the Torah, how that became such a central part of Jewish life. And those were, of course, things that were mobile. You could move them from one place to another. And in terms of explaining the survival of the Jewish people, we have spoken about how there were Jewish communities in existence already before the destruction of the Jewish community in the land of Israel, is what allowed for the Jewish people to be able to continue to exist. So what explains the survival of the Jewish people and of Judaism after the Holocaust? And it seems to me the answer is precisely the rebirth of the Jewish state. And so in 1 week, we observe a day of remembrance for the Holocaust, and in the next week, we celebrate the rebirth of a Jewish country. And the two are so connected because without the state of Israel today, it seems to me difficult to imagine that Judaism and the Jewish people would have survived the Holocaust, and not only survived, but would really be in a state of flourishing. I mean, one can argue that Jewish life is as strong today as perhaps it has ever been. And the reason for that was that rebirth that came with the Zionist movement that started in the 1800s and ultimately with the founding of the state in 1948 and the tremendous success that the state of Israel has had over the decades. And one needs to emphasize that the rebirth of Israel is not only a matter of a sovereign state and a political entity and, an independent country, but the rebirth of Jewish culture that was part of Zionism is also highly significant. And perhaps the most prominent aspect of this is the rebirth and the resuscitation of the Hebrew language. It is hard to believe that today there is a country that has all of the modern institutions of life and is an advanced culture with science and technology, and that country functions using the language of the Bible. It's an amazing thing when you think about it. And let's remember, that didn't just happen. The fact of the matter is the resuscitation of Hebrew and of the rejuvenation of Hebrew literature began in the 1800s already and was really part and parcel of the Zionist movement. There were already writers and poets in Eastern Europe who were creating modern Hebrew, so that by the time Jews were in Israel, in Palestine in large numbers, there was already a Hebrew literature and the basis for a modern Hebrew language that could serve the population there. And of course, over the decades, that language has really, again, the word is flourished. It has created an enormous body of literature. It has shown itself capable of expressing all of the aspects of modern life. So that resuscitation of Hebrew language is perhaps the most obvious of the achievements of a cultural rebirth that has accompanied the physical and political rebirth of the Jewish state. But this is, I think, the answer and to the question of how did we survive the Holocaust, because there has been a rebirth of Jewish life that really has no parallel. I don't think you can find in post-biblical history. Again, you would have to go back to the biblical period, to the return of the exiles from Babylonia. That would be the only thing that you could compare to what we have witnessed in the 20th century, the rebirth of Jewish life in the land of Israel. And so these holidays that we mark on the calendar at this time of year and which come close together, they really do mark the most significant events in all of Jewish history since the end of the biblical period. And it is something that is of tremendous importance for us to note these occasions and to perpetuate them and to make them an integral part of Jewish life. I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos.